I was scrolling on Twitter the other day when I saw a tweet that filled me with dread. With approximately $80 billion cash and cash equivalents, Microsoft is preparing an offer of $16 billion for Valve. No stock, all cash. And if you're anything like me, you probably ask yourself a number of questions. How possible would this acquisition be? What would a Microsoft-owned Valve even look like? And most importantly, is this even real? Well, I've spent the last 2 weeks researching these questions to make this video. So without further ado, let's get started. I think the best place to start with this is to compare it with the Activision Blizzard acquisition. According to Microsoft themselves, the acquisition of Activision Blizzard was a move to bolster their gaming presence on all platforms and push to be the go-to for cloud gaming. Valve offers their own cloud service called Steam Cloud Play. However, this is likely insignificant in Microsoft's interest in the company. According to most, Valve owns around 75% market share of the PC gaming market, which I predict is where Microsoft's interest lies. Another thing we have to consider is Valve's willingness to sell. For those that don't know, unlike Activision Blizzard, Valve is not a publicly traded company. Instead, Valve Corporation is privately owned, where the owners are stakeholders rather than shareholders. These stakeholders are primarily consisting of investors, founders, and leading employees who directly affect the success of the company. In order to acquire the company, each stakeholder would have to agree to hand over their stake in the company to Microsoft in exchange for an amount based on their percentage of ownership. Unlike Activision Blizzard, Valve doesn't have a board of directors to approve or deny the acquisition, which I believe would hypothetically allow them to do a hostile takeover by going to each holder individually, but would this actually work? Gabe Newell, president and co-founder of Valve, owned 49% stake of Valve Corporation until 2019, where half of his stake was given to his ex-wife in a divorce, leaving Gabe with around 24% of the company. But still, he had the most stake in the company. Gabe definitely wouldn't give up his stake to the corporate giant for reasons we'll get into later in the video, but it is safe to bet that his ex-wife would for a good price, along with many other ex-employees and investors looking for a return. If Microsoft actually wanted to strategically take over Valve, it is more than reasonable to predict they would be able to for the right price. A price way more than $16 billion, of course. But stakeholders wouldn't be the only ones getting in the way of this happening, as the Federal Trade Commission and other antitrust federations would definitely prevent the acquisition, as it would pretty much guarantee a monopoly on the gaming industry, with it bringing an overwhelming majority of market share in console, PC, and mobile to Microsoft. But what if, hypothetically, everything goes in Microsoft's favor? What would a Microsoft-owned Valve look like? Microsoft and Valve are two very different companies, and they have two very different takes on consumerism. Microsoft takes the route of accessibility by making their library accessible at a discounted rate through Game Pass, investing millions into hardware to make their products usable by people with different disabilities, and offering offline and cloud capabilities to allow players to access their services from almost anywhere. While Valve also works hard to ensure most of these features for their products, Valve is mostly known for being the most consumer-friendly online service by offering things like their digital return policy and backing their users when they have been wronged. For example, let's go back to early May 2024 during the Helldivers 2 controversy, which I also made a video on and highly suggest you watch after this one. When Helldivers players on Steam were displaying their displeasure by leaving negative reviews and refunding their purchase, Steam was accepting all refunds, no matter the playtime, even though it more than likely would cost them money. Microsoft, more specifically the Microsoft Game Store, would never do this, because in order to get your game on the store, you have to apply and get it approved manually. Where Steam is a platform to purchase and play a plethora of games with a built-in community market and modding, Xbox pushes to make their store a first-party place to play the games they support. This is a dangerous precedent, as this would more than likely draw parallels onto Steam if acquired. A lot of the changes to Steam would reflect this ideology, where Xbox would put their branding on Steam and make it more of a liability for them. The first big change I could see them making is actually a change we've seen in the past by Rockstar. When Rockstar purchased 5M, they banned all use of copyrighted works on their service. This is to save themselves from potential lawsuits and solve the problem before it starts. We already saw Valve run into this issue earlier this year with Gary's mod, where Gary himself requested all mod makers to remove any copyrighted mods they made off the workshop. I could see Microsoft potentially removing the workshop in its entirety, as it does host a lot of liability risk. I personally remember in 2016, there were a small catalog of Gary's Mod Workshop add-ons that had viruses in them, and Xbox isn't one to risk allowing something like that to happen on their platform. Alongside them limiting the Steam Workshop, I could see them putting many other development features like SDKs, development tools, and Steam Store releases behind a subscription. Microsoft is a big fan of recurring payments, and this is just another way for them to benefit from Steam's consumerism. But enough with the downsides of the potential acquisition, let's talk about the potential positives. And honestly, they're quite similar to what we are seeing with Activision Blizzard. Firstly, the unification of the platforms would be a huge benefit. Similarly to what we see with EA Play currently, we would be able to purchase Game Pass directly from Steam and have the entire catalog at our disposal in one location. To add to this, console gamers would see more PC exclusive games make their way to console through Steam. We already know Steam was playing with this idea in the Steam console, which never made it past early development. Not to mention the hardware owned by Valve, like the Steam Deck and the unreleased virtual reality headset, would put Xbox into two markets their competitors are dominating and Microsoft hasn't entered yet. But when you weigh the pros and cons of this acquisition, I do believe the cons heavily outweigh the potential pros, and the FTC would likely see it the same way. Oh, and one more thing. You could definitely say goodbye to your hentai games. Now, let's go back and reanalyze the initial tweet. It claims Microsoft has $80 billion in cash and cash equivalents. This is essentially their spendable cash, which could be used on big purchases like we saw with Activision Blizzard. It also states they plan to offer Valve a $16 billion buyout, all cash with no Microsoft stock. If you didn't know already, many companies use stock to lessen the amount they have to pay up front for the acquisition while keeping the amount the same. This is also commonly seen when the company hopes to retain the company's employees by giving them a stake in the company. We saw this with Activision Blizzard, where shareholders and employees were given Microsoft shares at $95 for every Activision Blizzard share they owned. But let's take it another step back. Where did this information even come from? According to the original poster, this was brought up while they were inquiring about Deadlock, the newest game from Valve to be revealed very soon. They were overly vague with this, however, so I did a little bit of research on my own. And in actuality, this information comes from September 2023, when Microsoft was fighting with the FTC to acquire Activision Blizzard. They showed various unredacted documents and emails, which is where we find this information. In August 2020, Phil Spencer discussed with at the time Chief Director of Marketing Chris Capasala and Executive Vice President Takashi Nomoto over email about their prospects of acquiring Nintendo. He says he agrees that Nintendo is the prime asset for them in their path to consumer relevance, but he really doesn't see an angle to a near-term mutually agreeable merger of Nintendo and Microsoft without hostile action, which he doesn't believe would be a good move. But most importantly, at the very end, he states he has full support from the Microsoft Board of Directors to put in a bid for Nintendo or Valve. This is the only trace I could find of Microsoft expressing interest in Valve. The claims of them offering $16 billion for the company only in cash seems to be completely made up to my knowledge. So to answer the question, is this real? I would say at one point it could have been, but not anymore.